When you think about state management in React, it's hard not to think about Redux. And nobody thinks about Redux more than Mark Erikson, a key contributor on both Redux Toolkit and Redux. Redux Toolkit is going into version 2. Redux is going into version 5. And I have an exclusive interview right now that you should enjoy with Mark Erikson going into upcoming features, how it works with Next.js 13.4 and more. Let's get right into it. Mark Erikson, nice to meet you.
Hi.
Hey. So, Mark, you are contributor on Redux, or maintainer.
One of the 2 or 3 primary maintainers.
Primary, yeah, absolutely. And the inventor of
Redux Toolkit.
Awesome, cool. And now Redux is going into version 5 in Redux Toolkit 2.
Yes.
Awesome.
Which I already have managed to mix up at least once. I was publishing a whole slew of switching alpha packages to beta packages while I was at the airport within the last 48 hours.
Oh.
And
You're whoa, okay.
And I was trying to also publish a React Redux patch release that would bump the peer dependencies to include those. I screwed that up.
Oops.
And within 3 minutes, we had an issue report saying that the NPM install is failing because the peer dependencies don't exist.
Yeah,
and
the internet's great.
Hastily cranked that out within another 5 minutes.
I thought you were going to say, in the documentation, I just got the...
No, I literally got the peer dependency wrong.
Okay, wow. So, what's new? Why the big version bump?
Okay, so we came up with the idea for Redux Toolkit in early 2018. Yeah. Really made the push to get to 1.0 in late 2019. Redux Toolkit 1.0 came out in October 2019. I rewrote our tutorials in 2020 to teach it as the default. And it's really taken off since then in terms of number of downloads, mind share, people actually know that it exists, which is still a problem. There are still a lot of folks who don't know that Redux Toolkit exists. They don't know that it's how we want people to use Redux, but it is now a very recognized thing in the ecosystem.
Yes.
So currently, the current stable release is 1.9.5. And if you look at the history of the minor releases over the last 3 years, there's been a decently steady, series of new features. Create async thunk, create any adapter, RTK query in the data fetching layer a couple years ago, and the last couple of releases have really just been refining things.
Yeah, I think TypeScript upgrades.
Number of tweaks of that.
Yeah.
So it's the library itself is very, very stable, and it's really just been what are use cases that people in the ecosystem are trying to solve, that it would make sense to build something into RTK that does the 80% solution for this stuff.
Querying data from a server, making a mutation to a server.
Because the package came out, 4+ years ago, the basic structure of it in terms of what file formats are included in the package, ESM, CommonJS, et cetera.
Yeah.
How do you define the package formatting that says, hey, Webpack, ESBuild, Vite, find these packages and stuff was kind of out of date. So, and on top of that, all of our packages have always been published basically trying to target IE11 as the least common denominator.
Yeah, makes sense. You want maximum compatibility.
Yeah. So we haven't needed to do a major release in terms of breaking changes to the APIs, but it's really the package formatting stuff that really started this drive towards let's do a set of major version releases. I'll be honest, trying to get proper ESM CommonJS compatibility, whatever that actually means.
Right.
I've almost literally been living in fear of that for multiple years.
Yeah.
I've been piling up this list of 150 bookmarks that tell you how to do it in umpteen dozen different incompatible ways.
Right.
People have told me that adding the exports keyword to your package JSON is a breaking change. I'm I can't. So I knew it was going to be something I had to face eventually. So we put out RTK 1.9 in November of last year. I took a month or two, off during the holidays to just kind of chill and relax. started actively trying to work on figuring out the package version, package formatting changes early this year. And my first couple attempts that I thought maybe kind of worked, people promptly popped up and told me, no, you're wrong in like 15 different ways.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard thing to figure out.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
And I actually had to backtrack, and I took a bunch of time to set up a bunch of little Redux Toolkit example apps that exercised each of our entry points. And then I proceeded to copy paste that code into a CRA4, CRA5, Vite, Next, even like a React Native. And tried with React Native. Like, I added all these things to our CI.
Yeah.
I also found a really, really useful tool called Are the Types Wrong from one of the TypeScript developers. And it inspects your package formatting, and it tells you how it thinks it's finding each of the defined entry points and the corresponding TypeScript versions, and it will let you know if there's any kind of like a mismatch.
Yeah.
So I set all these things up in Redux Toolkit CI so that on every PR, it's taking the PR build, installing it in each of those example apps, and hopefully telling us if I just did something stupid and broke things.
Yeah.
Because I need to make sure that it builds and TypeScript compiles and runs correctly in each of these different bundler combinations.
Yeah.
And there's probably like a half dozen more tools and combinations I ought to be checking against.
Right.
So after
You definitely hit the highlights, though,
yeah.
for sure.
So after having spent multiple months of weekends and free time messing with that stuff, I was then ready to take another shot at updating the package formatting based on some of the advice that I was getting. I hope I've got it mostly right this time. So like the biggest driver for all these major versions has been getting the package formatting right.
Right.
Also, we've stopped transpiling the bundles to target IE11.
Okay.
So it's now just
good.
straight up modern JavaScript.
Yay.
And if your target browser doesn't support it, that's on you to deal with.
Yeah, as it should be.
The exception is, it turns out Webpack 4 does not understand the exports keyword in package.json. It's still just looking for like module or main at the top level.
Yeah, I think that was one of the big shifts with Webpack 5 was the support for ESM, right?
Yeah. And it also doesn't support parsing, optional chaining, or object spreads.
Okay.
And unfortunately, Webpack 4 is still in pretty significant use, whether it's Create React App 4 or apparently I think Expo's Web Target uses it, Storybook maybe. So I am reluctantly going to be including...
I think Storybook is updated 5, but yeah.
But like existing projects.
Sure, yeah, okay.
So I'm going to be reluctantly including a Webpack 4 specific compatibility build in each of the packages that has a .js extension instead of .mjs.
Right.
And still at least transpiles away the optional chaining and the object spreads, just so that I'm trying to be reasonably maximally compatible. So,
but I guess a major version bump is good. I think what was the one? I think it was like node fetch. That one version of the next was major version bumped, and it would change the ESM.
Yeah, a lot of the packages did that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So package formatting and transpilation are the biggest kind of like sort of breaking changes, although if we've done it right, it'll literally just be you update to the new version and it all just magically works.
Yep.
We hope.
Okay.
We are taking advantage of this to do some actual breaking changes. There are a few different APIs and options and stuff that we've deprecated. For example, Redux Toolkit's create reducer and create slice.extra reducers options had originally accepted an object lookup table that would match type strings to the functions, the reducer functions that we're supposed to run.
Yeah.
It ran, and it was really nice and simple when RTK first came out and we were still kind of like a JavaScript first library. It's horrible for TypeScript because TypeScript has no idea what the TS type of the action object is going to look like when the key of this object is just a string.
Yeah.
So we had later come up with this callback syntax where you pass in the action creator function, which has the types applied, and now it can infer that like your action.payload field is a to-do,
right,
or whatever.
Yeah.
So we've been encouraging people to use this callback syntax for a while, and we officially deprecated the object form in 1.9, like a runtime warning and everything. We've ripped that out in 2.0.
Okay, so cleaning up the interface, making it ESM. Yeah.
And there's a few other options and fields that we deprecated, which we've pulled out.
Yeah.
We are adding a few new features, and some of them probably needed to be in a 2.0. Others were just like, well, this is where we're focusing our development at this point. Yeah. We've got a new maintainer that recently joined. His handle is Eskimo Joe, and frankly, he's just been
awesome.
He's just been cranking out PRs over the last 2 or 3 months.
Oh wow!
Which is great because a lot of the stuff he's been doing, I don't think I would have known how to work on myself, or certainly would not have had the time to do. And so, like a year ago, the other primary maintainer, Lenz Weber, had tossed out an idea for what he referred to as like a combined slices API. So the Redux core has always had this combined reducers, where you take like the posts reducer and the comments reducer and you mash them together into an object. But Redux Toolkit has this idea of a slice where it's like you generate an object that has the reducer and the action creators and a couple other fiddly bits attached to it.
Right, and you got to go and send those off to the various, create store or whatever.
So the idea was, number one, what if we had a combined slices API, which is sort of like a super combined reducer, as you pass in the whole slice object.
That sounds great.
And like one little like quirky bit was in create slice, you provide a name field. And this is only used as like the prefix of the action type strings.
Yes.
So if I say name to-dos,
right,
and then I have a reducer function called
it's
to-do added.
To-dos dot,
or to-dos / to-do added.
All right, to-do slash.
But there was no guarantee that you would attach the reducer as that name to your root state.
Oops.
Like most of the time, you're probably going to say like, the root is state.todos. But it could have been like state.fred or state.hello or something.
Right.
It's just wherever you attached it.
Yeah.
So we're kind of trying to actually push towards a little bit of a convention that you're probably using that name field as the root state key.
Yes. Simpler is better.
So combined slices is going to like look to do that automatically. It also has some support for lazily adding slices over time.
Oh, neat.
So people have always been able to do like lazy loading of reducers and injecting them, but there was nothing built into the Redux core. There was nothing built into Redux Toolkit. So there was like a docs page that said, here's kind of like a copy paste example. The problem is you have to keep track of all the old slice reducers so that you can take the new one, add it, then call combine reducers again. So you have to keep all of them around so you can additively do it. What this combined slices thing does, it's actually going to keep track of those internally.
Oh.
And like it generates this reducer, and then the reducer function has a couple extra methods added to it for like .inject or something like that. And to be honest, I haven't even played with it. Like I looked at the PR and I wrote up the release notes based on like the PR and the tests.
And it all looks good.
I haven't tried it.
Yeah.
But my understanding is you don't even have to call store.replace reducer. You just set up the reducer once, and then you can call like reducer function .inject and pass in another slice, and it just puts it in there.
Oh, nice.
Automatically.
Yeah.
So we are trying to at least come up with something that would help with that like lazy loaded use case.
Fantastic.
There's a, this is going to sound so funny when I say this, there's a dynamic middleware that we've added. So like the idea is like the middleware list was always fixed when you create the store.
Yeah.
Unchangeable. I'd seen a couple examples of where people would like, set up like a middleware that keeps track of which ones you have so you could insert or remove them later on.
Sure.
And I know some of the other like ecosystem dynamic loading packages did something along that lines. So we've tried to create kind of like one of those. To be honest, I still don't even know where people would end up using it all that much, but we had the idea, we made it.
I guess it's like conditionally add or remove a logger or whatever. I don't know. Yeah.
So there's that. Create slice now. Actually, this is kind of a big one.
Okay.
Create slice now lets you define thunks and selectors inside the create slice call. Previously, you would have to call create async thunk elsewhere in the same file, and then you referenced that in the extra reducers field, because the point was these action types were defined outside of create slice, and we want to listen to those in addition to whatever the slice defined for itself.
Right.
Similarly, you've got this weird dichotomy where the slice reducer technically doesn't know where it's going to get added, but the selectors you write in the same file have to know that it's going to be state.todos.
Right. Back to your naming convention issue. Right. Yeah.
So we'd been asked about this a number of times, and the biggest problem was always the TypeScript thing. Like, we could totally figure out a way to call create async thunk inside create slice, but if you're doing it with TypeScript, you end up with a circular types problem.
Oh no.
Because thunks can access root state and dispatch.
Oh.
But we normally tell you to infer the root state type from the store, which gets it from the slices, and but bad things happen.
Right.
So where we settled on is a less than perfect but mostly workable compromise. So in the same way that the extra reducers field is a callback function that lets you do kind of a builder style kind of a thing, the reducers field can still be just a plain object exactly the way you've had it. You can, however, write it as a callback now.
Okay.
And similar to how RTK query defines the endpoints, so it's technically a callback function, but you return an object that is like build.query, build.mutation for each of the fields. In the same way, you return an object that is like create.reducer, create.preparedReducer, create.async thunk.
Okay. Nice.
And so the syntax for defining the thunks ends up being a little bit shorter. If your thunk and your async fetching function need to access the root state or dispatch, you end up having to manually cast it to the correct type. It's not ideal, but it's hopefully something you're not doing as much anyway. And in the worst case, you can always still define the thunk outside the slice.
Nice.
And it's something that a lot of people have asked for, even with RTK query, hopefully handling a lot of the data fetching stuff.
Yeah. And speaking of RTK query, and I would say, are you familiar with the new app router and?
Decently, a lot of the discussion. Again, have not had time to get hands-on.
All right. I mean, do you have, there's a whole contingent of folks who are very happy with the next Redux wrapper and pages and how they can access data both on the server side and on the client side symmetrically. Like, what would be your solution? I posited my own solution. It was a total hack.
I think I saw that. I didn't watch the video, but I saw the thread.
Yeah.
The really short answer right now is we don't have an answer.
Okay.
To expand on that a little, so Dominic Dorfmeister, the maintainer of React Query, just put up a post entitled, "You Might Not Need React Query." And it was a great post. Folks ought to go read it. But I think the basic thesis was, look, React Query is a client-side data fetching and caching solution.
Yes.
Server components are meant to move that data fetching to the server and deal with it all there, so that the rest of your app is just components getting data from props.
Right.
If you choose to do that, you have mostly eliminated the need for React Query. And it's actually sort of a similar parallel to how people used to say, I switched from Redux to React Query and I deleted 10,000 lines of code. It's like, well, yeah, because you picked a different tool for the same job.
Yeah.
And it's a purpose-built tool for that use case. So of course you're able to delete all the extra code you had to write by hand. So I think to a certain extent, I mean, part of the the unspoken goal of server components is to eliminate the need for having data fetching libraries in your app like almost at all.
Yeah.
There are a lot more complications. So Lens, my RTK co-maintainer and creator of RTK Query, just started working at Apollo client as his day job.
Yes,
a
and
couple
they have
months
an
ago.
amazing hack around RSCs
Yes.
that gives symmetric data access on both the client and the server.
Yeah, so
And I think that's what people are looking for.
Yeah, so he went off and did this huge deep dive into like how are client data fetching libraries going to work with server components. And half the answer is they can't, and half the answer is but
It's really complicated if you want to make it work. Yeah.
So he hasn't had time to circle back around and kind of like apply that thinking to RTK Query yet, but his research was kind of dual purpose
Yeah.
in that sense. So we don't have actual guidance at the moment. One issue we have seen, and I think this is actually, you probably, I think, ran into this with your video from what I was seeing. RTK Query has 2 entry points. There's the plain JavaScript version, which people could use with Vue as well.
And there's another one that's hardbound to hooks.
Right.
And being hardbound to hooks, it uses context.
Exactly.
And using context breaks
Yeah.
RSCs, yes.
Yeah, so what, I think it's like if you call create context in a server component, it crashes or
Oh
something
no,
like that?
if you include code that at any point calls create context,
Yeah.
then even if you don't invoke it on the server,
Yeah,
it's
and
gone.
RTK Query.
There's no, because there's some hacking basically to have a create context-less version of React or bindings or whatever that it uses. Yeah.
Yeah. So RTK Query generates hooks. It imports from React Redux.
Which is nice.
React Redux has a singleton
have hooks,
context
it's great,
instance.
yeah.
And if you try to use RTK Query's create API on the server in conjunction with server components, it'll explode. So we actually, like 2 days ago on Reddit, someone pointed out they were wanting to do something with like dependency injection and RTK Query and like dynamically injecting their own API client to be able to make the data fetches with the endpoints.
Yes. Yeah. I was okay. Yes.
And I popped in and said, okay, yeah, we don't necessarily have a great solution for that, although it turns out that there was something involving thunks that Lens thought of. But I dropped that thread into our internal DM channel, and we were tossing around ideas. And going back to the major versioning thing, I wasn't planning to do a major version of React Redux because there aren't any real changes we need to make to it. And then Lens brought up the whole create context, server component explosion thing. And this is just at the level of like we were brainstorming for like 15 minutes. But it's like, well, what if we did React Redux version 9? That would let me do all the same package formatting changes. But also maybe we change where and how we instantiate the context instance.
Yeah.
So that somehow we can at least let things work okay in server component land, maybe. Or alternately, I think what a couple people were asking for was, right now, the RTK Query core entry point and the RTK Query React entry point are 2 separate things. And the React one, like at build time, merges together the core functionality plus the React functionality. And what a couple people have asked for is like, would there be a way to like do my RTK Query setup kind of like at a core definition level and then generate the hooks as like a second step, so you could have kind of like the UI agnostic piece here and then do the React piece as a second layer.
Right.
And I actually think it's a great idea. Like no one had ever asked us about that before, so like it wasn't a thing we were thinking of, and I don't know how we would do it, but it actually seems like a pretty reasonable request.
Yeah, so RTK Query, as I recall, right, I'm not giving it fetch. It is hardbound to fetch, right? So
well, by default, but you can swap out what does the actual requesting.
Oh, okay, because that might be a pattern. I was thinking, okay, so instead of doing the hackery that I did, right, instead basically have like essentially a requester, right? This is going to be the fetch, whatever.
Well, so
and then my RSCs call that requester just directly. Here you go, I'm going to await that request. And then on the RTK Query side, I can just take that same exact function that makes that request and give it to RTK Query, and now it's going to do, so I can use the same base query code in the two locations. Is that possible?
Perhaps, and we can maybe like talk actual technical details later.
Yeah, okay.
So like basically, I think where I was going with all that was, number one, we don't have an answer for like how to use RTK query with server components at the moment.
Yeah.
It's clearly a thing people would like to try to do.
Yeah.
Lens has done research around Apollo that would potentially be applicable in some ways for RTK query if we can figure it out.
Yeah.
But also, like literally just within the last couple of days, we were brainstorming a couple ideas of how could we solve some of the technical incompatibilities around this sort of thing. We don't have idea. We don't even have ideas yet, but we're starting to have a little bit of that discussion.
Yeah. Interesting. Very cool. I don't want to waste more of your time.
Let me wrap up by summarizing where we're at.
Sure.
So RTK, I published 2.0 beta while I was at the airport 2 days ago.
After the version mix-up, yes.
Yeah. Along with that, we've got Redux Core 5 beta, which amusingly, we converted the core to TypeScript in 2019 and then never published it.
What?
Version 4 worked fine.
All right.
And it was going to be a major version.
A handwritten .dts file or something?
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
Okay.
So
I'm surprised at the number of libraries that actually do that, by the way, that aren't written in TypeScript but have DTS files. Even some like Shocker or some of like the big ones that people think about. Yeah.
Yeah. So we are doing these in conjunction. So RTK2 depends on Redux 5.
Right.
And we're going to put these out at the same time. Also, technically, had to bump the thunk package too. And we have tightened up a lot of the TypeScript types. For example, there are a lot of places that used to be any, or like there was like a any action type that says it's got a type field, and everything else in there could be any.
Could be anything.
And we've changed it to be unknown.
Oh, good.
In as many places as possible.
Excellent.
And it's probably going to cause a little bit of pain for people in some places, but the idea is we're going to kind of like force you to add a type guard that checks what the actual action is.
Sure.
And then you can safely access the fields inside.
That's fine.
So both the core and RTK are in beta. I don't have a timeline for how soon they're going to get final because, hey, we're doing this in our spare time.
Right.
And also,
thank you so much for that.
And we don't know how many more things. Like, I'm hopeful that we've figured out most of the general changes we're going to make. But even like this discussion in the last couple of days about RTK query, like that might involve some breaking changes.
Yeah.
So it'll hopefully be like a big sweep of like all these packages majoring at once, but you basically just update to RTK 2.0 and you're going to get pretty much all these.
Maybe a few headaches around any and unknown.
Yeah.
Otherwise, yeah.
We also are using Immer version 10.
Okay.
Michelle Westrate worked on version 10 a couple months ago, and he did a whole bunch of modernization things. It no longer has the ES5 compatibility fallback, so it needs proxies. He drastically improved the field copying, the actual update speed. It's significantly faster.
All right. Yeah, that's worth a lot.
I even contributed the build packaging update because of all the work
well,
I did with
you
the Redux
figured this
stuff.
all out. I mean, you should just do an article just on that.
I unfortunately am going to. I have been begging for years for someone who actually knows what they're doing to write like the comprehensive canonical guide to how to publish a package. No one's done that yet.
Yeah.
So I am unfortunately going to write an article that is not the canonical guide, but it's here's all the things I've learned the hard way. Yeah. This is not authoritative, but
it's super valuable.
Hopefully it's useful. So Immer 10, smaller bundle sizes, modern JavaScript, all that kind of stuff. The beta's out there. We want people to try it out in your apps right now and tell us what breaks. Try out some of the new fields like the selectors field or thunks inside of slices and tell us like what works, what doesn't, what else should we tweak. Like one of the truisms of publishing a library is it doesn't matter how many alphas you put out or how many times you beg on Twitter.
Yeah, the moment that it goes, yes.
You get zero feedback and then you publish the live version and then everyone else tells you what broke.
Yeah.
So we would love pre-release testing as much as possible.
Awesome.
But hopefully within the next 2 to 3 months, maybe.
Okay. So if I'm a maintainer of an app, I can just do 5.0-beta And
yeah.
now I'm on that beta build.
Oh,
and
well,
I can go test.
RTK 2.0 beta.
Right. Yeah, excellent. Fantastic. I want to give a huge thank you to Mark Erikson, who's just a fantastic person, for spending time with us in this conversation and letting you know about all of the changes of Redux. I'm sorry the audio quality wasn't that great, but the content is fantastic, so I guess we just have to put up with it. Hopefully I can find a noise-free room in the Dex conference to ask even more questions. Be sure to put any questions that you have and you'd like to get answered in the comment section right down below. And of course, in the meantime, if you like the video, hit that like button. And if you really like the video, hit the subscribe button and click on that bell and you'll be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder comes out.